the rundown. Now, anti-Semitism is surging globally, including in the United States, where the Anti-Defamation League reported 251 incidents of anti-Semitism from May 11th to May 31st, a 115% increase over May of last year. Now, much of this, of course, is attributed to reactions to Israel's conflict with Hamas during the same period. American Jewish groups are demanding more action from the White House, calling for more funding to increase education awareness about anti-Semitism and more enforcement of laws to combat it, and also to fill the still vacant position of the State Department's Special Envoy for monitoring and combating anti-Semitism, or creating a comparable position to it. Well, with us in studio is the last man who held that position, ELAN, former U.S. Special Envoy to monitor and combat anti-Semitism. ELAN, thanks for joining us.
Calev, good to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, as I mentioned, we saw this upsurge in anti-Semitism over the past month. But we have to say, when rain falls, it has to fall on fertile ground. And it can't be that that upsurge in anti-Semitism simply just because of Israel's conflict with Hamas. There had to be an underlying causes that I presumably saw developing during the time when you were serving in that position. So talk about what you see as those underlying trends that led to that upsurge.
Look, anti-Semitism is on the rise, and there are a number of reasons for that. There are a number of sources. One source is the far right, these ethnic supremacists that they hate everyone unlike themselves, but always Jews first in the target. Then there's the far left, the radical left, which really expresses its Jew hatred usually as anti-Zionism and Israel hatred. Of course, we in the Trump administration didn't draw a distinction there. We said, my boss, Secretary Pompeo, was very clear, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people. Unless there be any lingering doubt about that, you can look at the orgy of hatred on the streets of U.S. cities, in Los Angeles, in New York. Jews attacked purely because they're Jews, had nothing to do with the supposed trigger, which is the firing of all these rockets into Israel by Hamas, and Israel's legitimate and of course legal response to those attacks. But that's it. Hatred of the Jewish state is hatred of the Jewish people, and then of course thirdly, militant Islam. Three sources. But why is anti-Semitism rising? Well, you've got the Holocaust, the memory of the Holocaust fading. And so what was unacceptable to say right after the Holocaust is now people are saying it more freely. And second of all, social media and the internet. For all the good, look, social media and the internet has been a gift in so many ways to our lives. But let's face it, it is the chief vector of so many societal sicknesses, chief among them being anti-Semitism. That's why we organized, Secretary Pompeo convened the first ever U.S. government-sponsored conference focused on combating online hate. We did that in the Trump administration because we said, look, we've got to address this without, God forbid, without infringing on the First Amendment and on freedom of expression, but we have to address this rise in hate on social media.
Well, let me ask you, because that is a fine line, as you said, the whole issue of the First Amendment in the United States. Now, of course, in Europe, for example, they do regulate more closely social media in a number of ways, and that may be, of course, a different approach and a different culture to the United States. But does the U.S. government need to not just hold conferences and meetings and hearings in Congress with the leaders of big tech, but actually pass more stringent laws that will some way regulate and then punish social media companies if they don't follow these regulations?
Well, sure. I mean, look, in America, as opposed to Europe, we can't punish people for saying hateful things. Even despicable, vile things are protected by the First Amendment, unless it rises, of course, to the level of criminal statements, conspiracies, or incitement to violence. But that doesn't mean there's nothing you can do. There's a lot you can do. Congress right now is looking at amending Section 230 of the Communications Decency Act, which, there are all kinds of different proposals in Congress looking at that, but that's one thing that's very important. Another thing is all kinds of other antitrust issues that are being looked at in terms of the social media companies and how big they are. So there are all kinds of things we can do, but I will tell you, Calev, this is a critical issue. And just because there's freedom of expression, and just because in the United States we're proud of the First Amendment, that doesn't mean there's nothing we can do. There's a lot we can do, and we've got to do it because the hatred that is being transmitted on social media with. By the way, I'll tell you, there's a recent European study just to show you how this is actually clear effects, right? Not just in theory. The period of time that it takes to radicalize a person to violent action, actually to act, is a fraction of the time when the radicalization process occurs online, as opposed to when it occurred offline through face-to-face interactions. So now we have hard data. What happens online doesn't stay online. What happens online has direct implications to the physical safety of Jews around the world. And so this is something that's got to be addressed seriously. And that means when it rises to the level of crime, when it's incitement to violence, we've got to come down very hard. Law enforcement authorities have got to come down hard on that. But when it falls short of criminal activity, there's still other things we can do. We can counter it. And the purpose of our conference wasn't just to make declarations. It was to bring people together for purposeful action to counter this tsunami of online hate we're seeing, and it's critical.
Right now, Elan, as I mentioned, the Biden administration has yet to fill the position that you held. I don't know if it's just sort of bureaucracy holding it up or if they may be rethinking that position. But there are some, for example, American Jewish groups actually have said that maybe that position should be moved to the Justice Department. Well, it would be in direct contact and influence, as we mentioned before, possible legal measures taken against perpetrators of anti-Semitism, or some argue it should be moved into the White House. Presumably in the West Wing, it would have greater influence on policy. What is your view?
So first of all, I can say with certainty the Biden administration is not rethinking this position. It's codified in law. Secretary of State Blinken said in a hearing very recently on Capitol Hill that they will be announcing a special envoy very soon.
Okay.
The short list, now again, it's rumors, but I've read who's on the short list. And so far, there's some very, very good people that are being mentioned. Deborah Lipstadt is one of them.
Sure.
I've worked very closely with her. I think the world of her. I think she would be fantastic. So, I think they're going to fill it very soon. The issue with the White House is this. Under the law, the special envoy has a responsibility only outside of the United States.
Right.
The foreign policy.
That's why it sits in the State Department.
That's why it's in the State Department. During my tenure, we focused on domestic issues as well. And that's not my statutory role, but the White House asked me to do that. So, for example, I paid an official visit to Jersey City after the murders there. I spoke at the funeral of Lori Kay in Poway, at Chabad of Poway. So we focused on domestic issues, but that was ad hoc. There is some talk about codifying that so that either the special envoy or another senior official would be able to focus on anti-Semitism domestically. I'm all for it. I think it makes sense for the special envoy to do it because they have the expertise and the staffing and the knowledge to do it. But either way, I think it's important to fill that domestic portfolio.
Now, let me ask you, addressing anti-Semitism in the U.S. is complicated by the fact that it's become somehow caught up a little bit in partisan politics. You mentioned extreme right, extreme left. There are some who accuse your former boss, President Trump. Some will point fingers at the Democratic Party now, or certainly elements in that. Is it possible to is it going to be possible to take the issue out of sort of the partisan rancor that it's become involved in so that it's addressed sort of equally by all political sectors? Well,
I'll tell you, Calev, the very simple answer is the way to do that is to call out anti-Semitism on your own side when you see it. We did that. When we saw far-right anti-Semitism, we were very quick to condemn it and call it out. And in fact, my first trip as envoy overseas was to deal with what you might call far-right anti-Semitic political parties in Eastern and Central Europe. Not in government, I have to say, but far-right parties that are creating anti-Semitic foment. So we called it out, we dealt with it. We need people on the left to call out and deal with anti-Semitism on the left. And when members of Congress say despicable, unthinkable things, what would have been unthinkable a few years ago, rank and file Democrats need to stand up and say, this is anti-Semitic, we condemn it, we don't accept it, we're going to excommunicate and marginalize those members of Congress and those factions that spout this vile, despicable propaganda. And I don't hear enough of that. Let me tell you what. One of the most briefly, one of the most disturbing meetings I had in my 2 years as envoy, I met with a UK Labour MP who walked out of the Labour Party. She said, I won't sit at the same table with anti-Semites. This Labour MP said to me, the disaster that we have in England all started on the campuses. We did nothing. Then it moved into the Labour Party. And we did nothing because we said it was just a far left fringe. We did nothing. They won, we lost. And now I don't have a political party anymore. Now, the good news is that was before the election. The election very clearly corrected that trend. But that's a warning sign to us in America. We've got to act when we see anti-Semitism and call it out.
Okay, Elan, CARR.